The words sliced through me with surgical precision, each syllable delivered with the kind of practiced indifference that only comes from careful rehearsal. Mom, don't bother coming to the wedding. We want close family only. I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed against my ear, watching the morning light dance across the surface of my coffee. The same ritual I'd performed every day for 37 years in this house. The house where Ethan had taken his first steps, spoken his first words, learned to ride the bicycle his father had assembled with such meticulous care that last Christmas before the accident. The mug in my hands was one David had given me for our 10th anniversary, hand-painted with hibiscus flowers from our honeymoon in Maui. The irony of holding it while my son delivered his verdict wasn't lost on me. Close family only. The phrase echoed in the sudden hollow space where my maternal certainties used to reside. I, who had raised him alone after David's death, who had worked 3 jobs to keep him in private school, who had sat through every soccer game, every school play, every parent-teacher conference with a smile plastered on my face, even when the other mothers whispered about the widow, who couldn't quite afford their circles. I was apparently not close family. The silence stretched between us, filled with 28 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees kissed better, report cards celebrated, heartbreaks consoled. I could hear him breathing, waiting for my response, perhaps bracing for the tears or recriminations he'd become so adept at deflecting since adolescence. Instead, I found myself studying the morning shadows across my kitchen floor, remembering how David used to say that forgiveness was sometimes the cruelest kindness you could offer someone. "Of course, sweetheart," I heard myself say, my voice steady despite the hairline fracture spreading through my chest. "I understand completely. You want your special day to be perfect." The relief in his voice was immediate and telling. He'd expected resistance, perhaps tears, certainly the kind of maternal guilt that had always been my weapon of last resort when reason failed. Instead, I gave him grace he hadn't earned, forgiveness he hadn't requested, the kind of unconditional acceptance that had shaped our relationship since the day the hospital placed him in my arms. "Thanks, Mom. I knew you'd get it. Madison's family is, well, you know how they are about keeping things intimate." Madison, the investment banker's daughter with the perfect teeth and the trust fund that had bought her way through an Ivy League education she'd never used for anything more meaningful than party planning and charity luncheons. Madison, who had never worked a day in her life but spoke eloquently about finding herself during her year abroad in Tuscany, funded by Daddy's American Express Black Card. I'd met her exactly twice, both occasions carefully orchestrated encounters where she'd smiled politely and called me Mrs. Chun, despite my repeated invitations to use my first name, as if the formality could maintain the distance she clearly preferred. She was beautiful, I'll give her that. The kind of effortless beauty that comes from good genetics, expensive skincare, and the confidence that money provides. 26 years old with the smooth skin and bright eyes of someone who had never known real hardship, never sat beside a hospital bed counting breaths, never chosen between groceries and utility bills, never explained to a 6-year-old why Daddy wasn't coming home anymore. Her parents have very specific ideas about wedding protocols, Ethan continued, his voice taking on that careful tone he used when he knew he was treading on dangerous ground. They've hired this wedding planner who specializes in exclusive events. Everything has to be perfectly coordinated. Perfectly coordinated. I wondered if that included coordinating me out of existence, erasing the inconvenient reminder that their new son-in-law came with history that didn't fit their pristine narrative. A mother who worked as a high school guidance counselor rather than lunching at country clubs. A background that included secondhand clothes and scholarship applications rather than trust funds and summer homes. We exchanged pleasantries for another few minutes, the kind of superficial conversation that fills space without conveying meaning. He told me about the venue, some exclusive estate in Napa Valley that required a year-long waiting list, and a deposit that exceeded my annual salary. He mentioned the guest list, carefully edited to include only Madison's sorority sisters and the sons of his future father-in-law's business associates, people whose acceptance he'd been courting since the day he'd brought her home to meet me. When I hung up, I allowed myself exactly 60 seconds to feel the full weight of his betrayal. I stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of a life spent in service to someone who had just informed me I wasn't worthy of witnessing his greatest joy. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, covered with photos spanning 3 decades: Ethan's first day of kindergarten, his high school graduation, his college acceptance letter, none of which Madison had shown the slightest interest in during her brief visits to my home. Then I poured another cup of coffee, added the extra cream David had always teased me about, and began to plan. The call came the next morning, as predictable as sunrise. I was in my garden, deadheading the roses David had planted during our 3rd year of marriage, when my phone buzzed against my hip. The display showed Ethan's name, and I let it ring 3 times before answering, allowing myself the small pleasure of making him wait. "Mom, I have a huge favor to ask." His voice carried that particular tone, the one he'd perfected as a teenager when he wanted something expensive or forbidden. It was the same voice he'd used to ask for the car keys at 16, for college tuition money at 18, for the down payment on his condo at 25. The voice that assumed my automatic compliance, that had never learned to hear the word no. "Good morning to you too, sweetheart. How was the bachelor party?" He laughed, that easy, dismissive sound that had become his default response to anything he perceived as maternal small talk. "It was great, Mom, really great. But listen, I need to ask you something important. Madison's been dreaming about honeymooning somewhere really special, and I remembered the house in Maui." The house in Maui. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my hand shake around my coffee mug. My sanctuary. The oceanfront property David and I had purchased during our 5th anniversary trip, back when we still believed we had decades ahead of us to fill it with grandchildren and golden anniversaries and the quiet contentment that comes from a life well lived together. The place where we'd made love on the beach under stars that seemed close enough to touch. Where we'd planned the addition that would house the children we thought we'd have time to conceive. Where I'd scattered his ashes from the cliff overlooking the bay, where we'd first talked about growing old together, about teaching our grandchildren to body surf and build sandcastles and recognize the difference between tourist fish and the ones that belonged. I hadn't been there since the funeral. Couldn't bear to see the sunrise he'd never witness again. Couldn't walk the beach where we'd made plans that cancer had stolen away with surgical precision. But I'd kept it maintained through a local property management company, kept it perfect and ready, as if preserving it might somehow preserve the life we'd planned to live there. Every month for 5 years, I'd written the check for upkeep and utilities, maintaining a shrine to possibilities that would never be realized. "The house," I repeated, my voice carefully neutral while my mind reeled with the audacity of his request. "Yeah, I mean, it's just sitting there empty, right? And Madison's always wanted to see Hawaii. She's never been anywhere tropical except that resort in Cancun her family goes to every spring break. It would mean everything to us, Mom. Really. We looked at some of those luxury resorts, but they're so impersonal, you know? And expensive. The house would be perfect for what we want. Just sitting there empty." As if 20 years of memories and dreams were simply unused square footage, as if the place where his father and I had conceived the future that included him was nothing more than convenient real estate to be utilized at his pleasure. As if the bedroom where David had first told me he loved me was just another vacation rental to be borrowed and discarded. "We've been talking about it all week," he continued, his enthusiasm building as he mistook my silence for consideration rather than shock. "Madison saw the photos on your Facebook from when you and Dad went there for your anniversary. The one with the sunset from the deck?" She practically swooned. "She's been showing them to all her friends, talking about how romantic it would be." The photos. I remembered that trip, our 15th anniversary, when we thought we had all the time in the world. David had insisted on hiring a photographer to capture what he'd called practice shots for our eventual silver anniversary celebration. We'd been so foolishly optimistic then, so certain that love and determination could overcome anything life might throw at us. The photos showed us tanned and laughing, his arm around my waist as we posed on the deck that overlooked the Pacific, both of us blissfully unaware that cancer was already growing inside him, that we had less than 3 years left together. Of course, Ethan. I'll have the keys sent over today. The words came out of my mouth before I'd fully processed the decision, but once spoken, they felt inevitable. His relief was audible, a long exhale that told me exactly how much resistance he'd been prepared to overcome. God, Mom, you're the best. I knew you'd understand. I'll take amazing care of it, I promise. We'll only be there a week. Madison's already started planning what she wants to pack. She bought this whole new wardrobe for the trip. Bikinis and sundresses, and these shoes that probably cost more than most people's rent. A week in the place where his father and I had planned to celebrate every anniversary until death do us part. A week where his new wife would sleep in the bed where I'd once dreamed of watching my grandchildren nap in the afternoon sun, their small bodies exhausted from building sandcastles and chasing waves. A week that would cost them nothing but would require me to open a door I'd kept sealed for half a decade, to allow strangers into the most sacred space of my marriage. But not quite strangers, I reminded myself. Not strangers at all. Just promise me one thing, I said, my fingers already reaching for the pen and paper I kept by the phone, my mind beginning to formulate a plan that was still taking shape in the corners of my consciousness. Anything, Mom. Whatever you need. The master bedroom closet. There's an antique trunk in the back corner, behind the off-season clothes. It's locked for a reason. Some things are better left undisturbed. He laughed, that easy, dismissive sound that had become his signature response to anything he perceived as maternal overcaution. Mom, we're not going to go through your stuff. We're on our honeymoon, remember? We'll be way too busy to do any exploring. The innuendo in his voice made my stomach turn slightly, not from prudishness, but from the casual way he dismissed the gravity of what I was offering him. This wasn't just a vacation rental or a convenient getaway. This was the repository of my most precious memories, the place where his father's presence still lingered in every grain of wood and whisper of the trade winds through the palms we'd planted together. I'm sure you will be, I said, allowing a hint of warmth to creep into my voice. But promise me anyway. That trunk contains things that are personal, private. Some doors are meant to stay closed. I promise, Mom. Scout's honor. Another laugh, as if my concerns were charmingly quaint rather than born from a deep understanding of human nature and the irresistible pull of forbidden knowledge. After ending the call, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, watching the light shift across the walls David had painted in shades of cream and sage, colors we'd chosen together during those blissful early years when our biggest disagreement was whether to splurge on crown molding. The house felt different now, charged with purpose in a way it hadn't been since his death. For 5 years, I'd been existing rather than living, maintaining routines that had lost their meaning, going through motions that felt increasingly hollow. But now I had a mission, a reckoning to orchestrate, a lesson to teach about the true cost of love and the weight of family bonds. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years, my fingers remembering the sequence, even though my mind had tried to forget. Island Property Management, this is Keone. Keone Nakamura had been our property manager since we'd first purchased the house, a local man whose family had lived on Maui for 6 generations and who understood the delicate balance between preserving a property and respecting the spirits that inhabited it. He'd been the one to scatter David's ashes when I couldn't bear to return to the island myself, the one who'd maintain the house exactly as we'd left it, as if he too understood that some places were too sacred to alter. Keone, it's Margaret Chun. I need you to prepare the house for guests. Mrs. Chun. His voice carried genuine warmth, the kind of affection that comes from shared grief and mutual respect. It's so good to hear from you. Are you finally coming back to us? Not yet, I said, though even as I spoke the words, I realized that might not be entirely true. But my son is getting married, and they'll be honeymooning there. I need the house ready for them, but I also have some very specific instructions. I spent the next hour on the phone with Keone, explaining exactly what I needed him to do. He listened without comment, his silence growing heavier as I outlined my requirements. When I finished, he was quiet for so long I thought the connection had been lost. Mrs. Chun, he said finally, his voice careful and respectful. Are you certain this is what you want? Once this door is opened, the truth will finally have its day, I replied. Some lessons can only be learned through experience, Keone. Some gifts can only be appreciated after they've been unwrapped. I understand, he said, though his tone suggested he understood more than just my instructions. It will be ready. The next 3 days passed in a strange suspension of normal time. I went through my usual routines. Teaching my classes at the high school, meeting with students about their college applications, attending the faculty meeting where we discussed budget cuts and standardized test scores, but it all felt like performance art, as if I were playing the role of Margaret Chun rather than actually being her. My colleagues noticed the change. Sarah Martinez, who taught in the classroom next to mine, commented on my improved mood during lunch on Wednesday. You seem different lately, she said, stirring her yogurt with the precise movements of someone who'd been dieting for 3 decades. Lighter somehow. Did you start taking those antidepressants Dr. Patel recommended? I smiled, the kind of serene expression that comes from knowing something others don't. Just looking forward to my son's wedding, I said, which was true in ways she couldn't possibly understand. The wedding itself took place on a Saturday in late September, during that perfect window of Northern California weather when the heat has finally broken but the rains haven't yet begun. I learned about it through social media posts from distant relatives, David's cousin Linda, who'd somehow managed to secure an invitation despite having spoken to Ethan exactly twice in the past decade. The photos were everything I'd expected. Madison radiant in a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, Ethan handsome in his custom tuxedo, the venue dripping with white roses and crystal chandeliers that caught the golden hour light with mathematical precision. I studied each image with the detached interest of an anthropologist, noting the details that revealed the careful orchestration behind the spontaneous joy. Madison's mother, resplendent in Mother of the Bride pink, holding court among the other society matrons. Madison's father, distinguished in his morning coat, shaking hands with men whose faces I recognized from the business section of the newspaper. The wedding party, arranged with the precision of a military formation, each face glowing with the kind of happiness that money can't buy but can certainly rent for an afternoon. And conspicuously absent from every single photograph, any trace of the groom's family history. No photos of David, no acknowledgement of the man who'd raised Ethan to be worthy of such celebration. No empty chair with a boutonniere, no memorial candle, no recognition that the groom had a father who'd loved him with fierce devotion until cancer stole that love away. It was as if Ethan's life had begun the day he'd met Madison, as if everything that came before was an inconvenient prologue to be edited out of the final version. I closed my laptop and poured myself a glass of the wine David and I had been saving for special occasions, the bottle we'd never opened because there had always been tomorrow for celebrations. The Bordeaux was perfect, rich and complex with undertones that spoke of patience and careful cultivation. I raised my glass to the wedding photo I kept on my mantle, David and me, young and radiant, convinced we had forever. Here's to our son, I whispered to his image. May he learn what love actually costs. The call about the keys came on Sunday morning, exactly as I'd anticipated. Ethan's voice carried the particular brand of exhaustion that comes from trying to appear perfect for an entire weekend, the kind of bone-deep fatigue that follows extended performance. Mom, I hate to bother you, but we need those keys. Our flight leaves tomorrow afternoon. I'd been expecting this urgency. Madison struck me as the type of person who planned everything down to the minute, who couldn't tolerate loose ends or uncertainty. The kind of woman who probably had their entire honeymoon itinerary color-coded and laminated, complete with backup plans and alternate routes. Of course, sweetheart. I'll have them messengered over this afternoon. You're a lifesaver. Madison's been counting down the days. She's got her whole schedule planned out: sunrise yoga on the beach, snorkeling at Molokini Crater, dinner at that fancy place in Wailea that got written up in Travel and Leisure. She's been researching the island for months. Research. As if Maui were a term paper to be studied rather than a living place with its own rhythms and mysteries. As if you could understand the island's soul through TripAdvisor reviews and Instagram posts rather than by sitting quietly on the beach at dawn, listening to the waves tell stories that predated human presence by millions of years. That sounds wonderful, I said, and meant it. I wanted them to experience everything the island had to offer, wanted them to fall in love with a place that had shaped the happiest years of my marriage. She's already packed like 3 suitcases full of resort wear. Ethan continued with the fond exasperation of a man still in the honeymoon phase of marriage. I told her we're only going for a week, but she says she wants to have options for every possible activity and mood. Women, right? Women. As if Madison's careful preparation were a charming quirk rather than the behavior of someone who'd never learned to trust that things would work out without meticulous control. As if the desire to have backup plans were feminine whimsy rather than the survival strategy of someone who'd never experienced real uncertainty. I thought about my own honeymoon, when David and I had packed everything we owned into 2 battered suitcases and driven his ancient Honda to a cabin in Big Sur that we'd rented sight unseen from a classified ad in the newspaper. We'd had $17 left after paying for the cabin, enough for groceries if we were careful, enough for gas to get home if we didn't take any detours. But we'd been rich in ways that Madison, for all her preparation and planning, might never understand. I'm sure she'll have a wonderful time, I said. The house has everything you'll need. Keone has been keeping it perfectly maintained. About that, I feel kind of bad that you've been paying to maintain a place you never use. Maybe after the honeymoon, we could talk about, I don't know, maybe selling it? Or at least renting it out to help offset the costs. The suggestion hit me like cold water, confirming suspicions I'd tried to dismiss as maternal paranoia. He wasn't just borrowing the house for his honeymoon. He was already calculating its value, already planning its disposal, already seeing it as an asset to be monetized rather than a sanctuary to be preserved. We'll talk about that when you get back, I said, my voice carefully neutral. For now, just focus on enjoying your honeymoon. After we hung up, I walked to my bedroom and opened the safe where I kept my most important documents. David's life insurance papers, my will, the deed to the Maui house, and, wrapped in tissue paper like a precious relic, the key to the antique trunk that had belonged to his grandmother. The trunk itself was a beautiful piece, hand-carved mahogany with brass fittings that had been polished by generations of loving hands. David's grandmother had brought it with her from China, packed with the treasures she'd managed to save from the life she was leaving behind. When she'd passed, she'd left it to David with specific instructions that it was to be passed down through the family, from parent to child, a repository for the memories that define their lineage. For 20 years, I'd used it to store the most precious artifacts of our marriage. Love letters David had written during his business trips. Photos from our early years together, when we were still learning each other's rhythms and dreams. The ultrasound images from the pregnancies that had ended too early, the children we'd lost before we could meet them. And finally, the documentation of his illness, the medical records, the treatment plans, the photographs I'd taken to document his decline, evidence of love's persistence in the face of inevitable loss. I'd added to the collection after his death. The clothes he'd been wearing the day he died, still carrying the faint scent of his cologne mixed with hospital antiseptic. The notebook where he'd written letters to Ethan for future milestones, high school graduation, college acceptance, wedding day, the birth of his first child. Letters that revealed a father's hopes and fears and desperate love for a son who would grow up without his guidance. And the photographs. God, the photographs. Not the sanitized versions I'd shared with family and friends, but the raw documentation of what it looked like when love endured beyond the point where endurance seemed possible. David reduced to 73 pounds, but still trying to smile for Ethan's camera during what we both knew would be their last Christmas together. David in the hospital bed, hooked to machines that measured the failing rhythms of his heart, still reaching out to hold my hand when the pain medications allowed him brief moments of clarity. These were the images I'd kept hidden, too brutal for public consumption, but too precious to destroy. Evidence that love wasn't always beautiful, that sometimes it was ugly and desperate and required a strength that hollowed you out from the inside. Evidence that marriage vows about, in sickness and in health, weren't romantic promises, but pragmatic preparations for the reality that love, real love, demanded everything you had and then asked for more. I'd never shown these photographs to Ethan. How could I? He'd been 16 when his father died, still young enough to need heroes rather than human beings. I'd protected him from the worst of it, had maintained the fiction that David's decline was peaceful and dignified, that he'd slipped away quietly in his sleep surrounded by love and acceptance. The truth was messier. David had died terrified and angry, raging against the injustice of leaving his family behind, sobbing with frustration at his body's betrayal and his inability to be the father and husband he'd always planned to be. He died asking me to promise that I'd tell Ethan how much he loved him, how proud he was, how sorry he was that they wouldn't have more time together. But children, even adult children, need their illusions. So I'd edited the story, had given Ethan the version where his father was brave and philosophical, where death was a gentle transition rather than a violent theft. I'd protected him from the truth, because that's what mothers do. They absorb the pain so their children don't have to carry it. Now, though, protection was no longer my priority. Education was. I spent Sunday afternoon arranging the contents of the trunk with the same careful attention I'd once given to creating David's memorial service. Everything had to be perfect, had to tell the story I needed them to understand. The love letters went on top, establishing the foundation of joy and hope that had defined our early years. Beneath them, the photos from our courtship and early marriage, evidence of the happiness that had seemed so permanent, so unassailable. Then came the harder truths, the miscarriage records, the fertility treatments, the years of hope and disappointment that had finally led to Ethan's miraculous conception. The documentation of how desperately we'd wanted children, how every month without pregnancy had felt like a small death, how Ethan's birth had seemed like proof that the universe was fundamentally benevolent. And finally, at the bottom of the trunk, the materials from David's illness. The progression photos that showed his transformation from vibrant husband to skeletal patient. The letters he'd written to his unborn grandchildren, the son he'd never seen married, the daughter-in-law he'd never met. The raw, unfiltered record of what it looked like when love persisted beyond the point where persistence seemed possible. I sealed the trunk and called Keone with final instructions. The keys were to be placed in an envelope on the kitchen counter, along with a welcome note and a bottle of champagne, the vintage David and I had been saving for our 20th anniversary. The trunk was to remain in its usual place in the master bedroom closet, locked but accessible to anyone curious enough to wonder what secrets it contained. "Are you certain about this, Mrs. Chin?" Keone asked one final time. Once they see what's inside, they'll understand what family actually means," I replied. "Some lessons can't be taught, Keone. They have to be experienced." Monday morning arrived with unusual clarity, the kind of crystalline light that makes even familiar landscapes look newly minted. I drove to school with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in years, as if I were finally moving towards something rather than simply away from grief. My students noticed the change immediately. "Mrs. Chun, you seem different today," said Jessica Rodriguez, one of my college-bound seniors who'd been struggling with her personal essay. "Like more present or something?" Present. Yes, that was exactly what I was. For the first time since David's death, I was fully inhabiting my own life rather than simply enduring it. I had purpose again, direction, a plan that extended beyond merely surviving another day. "Sometimes," I told Jessica, settling into the chair across from her desk, "we have to be willing to break things before we can fix them. Now, tell me more about this essay on overcoming obstacles. What's the real story you're trying to tell?" The hours passed quickly, filled with the usual rhythms of academic life. Classes to teach, papers to grade, college recommendations to write. But underneath the familiar routine, I felt the steady pulse of anticipation. Somewhere above the Pacific, Ethan and Madison were flying toward their honeymoon, toward the reckoning I'd so carefully orchestrated. Their flight was scheduled to arrive in Maui at 2:47 p.m. local time. I'd calculated that it would take them roughly an hour to collect their luggage and pick up their rental car, another hour to drive to the house, allowing for Madison's probable insistence on stopping at the grocery store to stock up on the organic produce and artisanal snacks that sustained her particular lifestyle. By 5 p.m. Hawaii time, 8 p.m. in California, they would be settling into the house, exploring rooms that David and I had furnished with such hopeful care. I imagined their delight at discovering the master suite with its panoramic ocean views, the kitchen stocked with champagne and fresh tropical fruit, the hot tub on the deck where the sunset painted the sky in shades that seemed too vivid to be real. I imagined Madison photographing everything for her Instagram account, carefully curating images that would make her friends envious of her perfect new life. And I imagined the moment, perhaps that first night, perhaps the second, when curiosity would overcome caution and someone would suggest exploring the closet, would notice the antique trunk tucked behind the off-season clothes, would wonder what secrets the groom's family had hidden away in such an obviously important container. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on Tuesday night, precisely when I'd estimated it would. I was reading in bed, working my way through a novel about family secrets and generational trauma, when my phone lit up with an unknown number. Hawaii area code. I let it ring 4 times before answering, savoring the anticipation. "Hello." The voice that greeted me was female, high-pitched, and trembling with something between hysteria and rage. Madison, though she sounded nothing like the poised young woman who'd sat in my living room making polite conversation about her graduate school plans. "What is wrong with you? What was in that trunk?" In the background, I could hear my son's voice, no longer the confident young man who had excluded me from his wedding, but something raw and broken. The sound of someone discovering that certain doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The sound of someone realizing that the family he'd married into had depths he'd never suspected, histories he'd never considered, pain he'd been too self-absorbed to acknowledge. I settled into the reading chair David had given me for our 15th anniversary, the one position to catch the morning light that would soon illuminate another day without him, and allowed myself a small smile. "Madison, I presume. How lovely to finally have a real conversation. This isn't funny. Ethan is, he can't stop. What did you do?" The hysteria in her voice was palpable, the kind of panic that comes from having your worldview shattered in an instant. I could picture her pacing the master bedroom, probably still in whatever expensive lingerie she'd packed for seduction, confronting images and realities that her privileged upbringing had never prepared her to process. I shared the truth about the man you married, I said calmly, about the family you've joined, about the love that created the person you claim to cherish. These pictures, they're sick. They're disturbing. Why would you keep something like this?
Sick.
Disturbing. As if love's persistence in the face of mortality were pornographic rather than sacred, as if the documentation of a family's journey through crisis were voyeuristic rather than necessary, as if the evidence of what David and I had endured together were somehow shameful rather than the most precious record of our marriage's true meaning. Those pictures, I said, my voice finding the steel that years of single parenthood had forged, show what it looks like when marriage vows are tested by reality. When in sickness and in health becomes more than pretty words spoken in front of flowers and photographers. But in these photos, her voice broke, unable to articulate what she'd seen. The progression from vital man to skeletal patient. The raw evidence of cancer's methodical destruction. The brutal honesty of love that persists beyond the point where persistence seems possible. He's dying. I finished for her.
Yes.
That's what people do, Madison. They get sick, they suffer, they die. Usually not at convenient times or in photogenic ways. Usually not according to anyone's careful plans or color-coded schedules. The line went quiet except for Ethan's ragged breathing in the background, the sound of someone trying to process grief that had been carefully managed and sanitized, now presented in its raw, unedited form. Your husband, I continued, has never seen these photos because I protected him from them. Because 16-year-old boys shouldn't have to carry the weight of their father's mortality, shouldn't have to witness the full brutality of what love requires. But 28-year-old men who exclude their mothers from their weddings? They're old enough for the whole truth. You're crazy, Madison whispered, but the conviction had gone out of her voice. This is abusive.
Traumatic.
We're calling our lawyer. You're welcome to try, I said, though we both knew there was no legal remedy for the truth delivered at an inconvenient time. But first, you might want to read the letters. What letters? The ones your husband's father wrote to him. For his wedding day, for the birth of his children, for the moments David knew he wouldn't be alive to witness. They're in the trunk, underneath the medical records. A crash in the background, something heavy hitting the floor. Madison's sharp intake of breath. Then Ethan's voice, closer to the phone now, raw with an emotion I hadn't heard from him since childhood. Mom, the single word carried decades of history. Every skin knee I'd kissed, every nightmare I'd soothed, every disappointment I'd helped him navigate. For a moment, he sounded like the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who believed his mother could fix anything with the right combination of love and determination. Hello, sweetheart. How's the honeymoon? A sound escaped him that might have been laughter or sobbing. Why didn't you ever show me these pictures? These letters? Why didn't you tell me? Tell you what? That your father spent his last months writing to grandchildren he'd never meet? That he documented every stage of his illness because he wanted you to understand that love doesn't end just because breathing does? That he died terrified and heartbroken, but still trying to be brave for our sake? I thought he was peaceful, Ethan whispered. I thought he just slipped away. He did, eventually, but not before fighting like hell to stay with us. Not before spending 3 months writing you letters he hoped would guide you through the milestones he'd miss. Not before making me promise that I'd tell you, someday, how much he loved you and how proud he was of the man you were becoming. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of revelations that couldn't be unseen or unknown. Finally, Madison's voice cut through the quiet, sharp with the kind of anger that comes from having your assumptions challenged. This is manipulation. Pure and simple. You couldn't stand that Ethan was happy, so you had to ruin it. Ruin it. I allowed genuine surprise to color my voice. I've given you the greatest gift possible. The truth about the family you've married into. The knowledge that your husband comes from people who understand that love isn't just champagne and sunset photos. That marriage isn't just a romantic adventure, but a commitment to endure each other's worst moments as well as celebrate the best ones. These pictures are horrifying. These pictures are honest, I interrupted. They show what it looks like when someone loves you enough to stay beside your hospital bed when you're no longer recognizable as the person they married. When you love someone enough to document their decline, because you know that someday someone might need to understand what real commitment looks like. But why now? Ethan's voice was small, broken. Why on my honeymoon? Why not before? The question I'd been preparing for, the one that cut to the heart of everything I'd done. Because before now, you weren't ready. Before now, you still thought love was about finding someone who made you happy instead of someone you were willing to suffer for. Before now, you thought family was an inconvenience to be managed rather than a foundation to be honored. That's not, I never. You excluded me from your wedding, Ethan. The words came out harder than I'd intended, years of accumulated hurt finally finding their voice. You told me I wasn't close family. You asked for my house, but not my presence. You wanted the benefits of our relationship without the complications of our history. Madison's parents insisted. Madison's parents, I said, my voice cutting through his excuse like a scalpel through tissue. Don't get to decide who belongs in your family. That's a choice you make, and you chose to pretend I didn't exist rather than risk their disapproval. Another crash, followed by Madison's voice, further away now but still audible. I can't look at these anymore. I can't, this is insane. People don't keep things like this. People who understand what love costs keep things like this, I said, though I wasn't sure she was still listening. People who recognize that marriage isn't a performance, but a commitment keep evidence of what that commitment actually requires. The letter he wrote for my wedding day, Ethan said suddenly, his voice thick with tears I could hear, but not see. He knew he wouldn't be there. He knew, I confirmed. Just like he knew he wouldn't see your children born, wouldn't teach them to ride bikes or help them with their homework or walk your daughter down the aisle someday. But he wrote to them anyway because love doesn't stop just because life does. What did it say? The letter? I closed my eyes, remembering the afternoon David had spent writing that particular letter, how he'd called me into his study to read it aloud, how we'd both cried at the beauty and tragedy of words written for a future he'd never see. It said that your wedding day would be the happiest and saddest day of his afterlife. Happy because you'd found someone to love, sad because he couldn't be there to shake your hand and welcome your bride to our family. It said that marriage was the closest thing to magic he'd ever experienced, but that the magic only worked if both people were willing to see each other clearly, flaws and fears and all the messy humanity that makes us who we are. You should read all of them. The one for your 30th birthday, where he writes about the mistakes he made as a young man and the lessons he hoped you'd learn earlier than he did. The one for when you become a father, about how having children changes you in ways you can't imagine until it happens. The one for when you lose your first parent, meaning me, about how grief is love with nowhere to go. The sound of sobbing, definitely Ethan now, the kind of tears that come from understanding how much you've lost and how much you never knew you had. In the background, I could hear Madison moving around, the sharp staccato of heels on hardwood, the rustle of fabric and the slam of drawers. Packing probably. Running from truths too large and uncomfortable for her carefully constructed worldview. Madison's upset. Ethan managed between sobs. Madison's scared. I corrected. She married a man she thought she understood, and now she's realizing that real intimacy requires confronting parts of each other that don't fit on Instagram. She's discovering that your family comes with history that can't be edited or filtered. She's talking about leaving, about catching the next flight home. That's her choice to make. Just like it was your choice to exclude me from your wedding. Just like it was your choice to ask for my house without considering what that meant to me. I didn't think. You didn't think. I agreed. You thought about what you wanted and assumed I'd comply, the way I always have. You thought about Madison's comfort and your in-laws' approval and your own convenience. But you didn't think about what it would feel like for me to give you the place where your father and I were happiest, where we made plans that included you, where I scattered his ashes because I couldn't bear to keep them in a house that felt empty without him. I'm sorry, he whispered, and for the first time since childhood, I believed he meant it. I'm so sorry, Mom. I didn't understand. Understanding comes at a price, sweetheart. Sometimes we have to lose something before we recognize its value. Sometimes we have to see the whole truth before we can appreciate the parts we've been given. What do I do now? She's really upset. She keeps saying this isn't normal, that families don't share things like this. Families that love each other share everything eventually, I said. The good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly, the parts that make us proud, and the parts that make us human. Madison comes from a different kind of family, one where pain is private and problems are solved with money and connections. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not our way. Our way. The Chun way. The way your father and I learned to love each other. Completely, without reservation, without editing out the parts that weren't convenient or comfortable. We loved each other's whole selves, not just the parts that were easy to live with. I don't know if Madison can handle that. The admission hung between us, heavy with implications neither of us was ready to fully explore. In the background, I could hear Madison's voice, sharp and demanding, making phone calls that would probably involve lawyers and therapists and whoever else wealthy families consulted when their carefully ordered worlds were disrupted by inconvenient truths. Then you'll have to decide what's more important, I said gently. A marriage built on comfortable illusions or one founded on complicated realities. A love that requires you to hide parts of yourself or one that asks you to be completely known. That's not fair. You can't make me choose between my wife and my family. I'm not making you choose anything, Ethan. I'm simply showing you what choice you've already made. You chose Madison's comfort over my feelings when you didn't invite me to your wedding. You chose convenience over consideration when you asked for the house without thinking about what it meant to me. Now you get to choose what kind of marriage you want and what kind of man you want to be within it. The photos of Dad, they're so hard to look at. They're supposed to be hard. Love isn't supposed to be easy, sweetheart. If it were easy, everyone would be good at it. If it were easy, it wouldn't be worth anything. But people don't usually document things like that. The dying, the suffering. People who've never experienced real loss don't document things like that, I corrected. People who understand that memory is fragile and time is finite document everything, especially the parts that hurt. Because someday, when the pain has faded enough to bear, those pictures become proof that love is stronger than death, that commitment means something even when, especially when, it's inconvenient. I keep thinking about all the times I complained about visiting him in the hospital, about how uncomfortable it made me, how much I hated seeing him like that. You were 16, I said, my voice softening with a maternal instinct that had never fully recovered from his childhood. 16-year-olds aren't equipped to handle their parents' mortality. That's why I protected you from the worst of it, why I managed his care and his medication and his appointments while you focused on being a teenager. But I should have been there more. I should have understood what you were going through. You were there exactly as much as you were capable of being there. Your father never wanted you to see him at his worst. That's why we timed your visits for his good days, why we made sure you remembered him as your father rather than as a patient. The letter for my wedding day, he wrote about walking me down the aisle. He practiced that walk every day during his treatment. I admit it, a truth I'd never shared before. Even when he could barely stand, even when the chemo made him so weak he could hardly lift his head, he would walk the length of the hospital corridor and back, practicing for a day he knew he'd never see. The sobbing intensified, and I found myself crying too, tears I'd held back for 5 years finally finding their release. We sat connected by technology and grief across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, sharing the mourning process I'd protected him from experiencing as a child. "I miss him," Ethan whispered, the simple words carrying the weight of years of unprocessed loss. "I miss him too," I whispered back. "Every single day." But missing him means we loved him, and loving him means we carry him with us everywhere we go. Madison doesn't understand. She keeps saying this is morbid, that normal people don't keep things like this. Madison has never lost anyone she couldn't live without, I observed. She's never had to choose between documenting pain and forgetting love. She's never had to decide whether memory is worth the cost of reliving trauma. What if she can't accept this? What if she can't accept me knowing this? The question every parent dreads, the moment when you realize your child's happiness might depend on their willingness to abandon the very foundations that shaped them. I thought about Madison, probably pacing the master bedroom that David and I had painted together, surrounded by evidence of a love that had endured beyond what seemed humanly possible, confronted with expectations she'd never been prepared to meet. "Then you'll know something important about the woman you married," I said finally. "You'll know whether she loves the real you, or just the version of you that fits her comfort zone. That's a terrible choice to have to make. It's not a choice I'm forcing on you, sweetheart. It's a choice that marriage eventually forces on everyone. The choice between being completely known and being safely hidden. The choice between intimacy that includes everything and intimacy that excludes what's inconvenient. I don't know what to do. You don't have to know yet. You just have to be honest about what you're feeling and what you need. You have to decide whether you want a marriage where parts of your history are off-limits or one where everything is open for discussion. The house, I understand now why you didn't want to give us the keys. I gave you the keys because I love you," I corrected. "But I gave you the whole truth because love without honesty isn't love at all. It's just mutual agreement to maintain comfortable illusions. Will you ever be able to forgive me? For the wedding? For not understanding what the house meant to you?" The question I'd been waiting for, the one that would determine whether this painful lesson had served its purpose. Forgiveness isn't something you earn, Ethan. It's something you receive. I forgave you the moment you called to tell me about the wedding, even though it broke my heart. I forgave you because that's what mothers do. We love our children through their worst decisions and hope they eventually grow into people worthy of that love. I want to be worthy of it. Then be honest. With Madison, with yourself, with me. Be honest about what you need and what you're willing to give. Be honest about what kind of man you want to be and what kind of marriage you want to have. The letters Dad wrote, can I keep them? They're yours, sweetheart. They were always meant for you. I just wanted to make sure you were ready to receive them. And the photos? I paused, considering. The photos were the hardest part, the most brutal evidence of what love looked like when tested by impossible circumstances. But they were also the most important proof that commitment meant something beyond comfort and convenience. Those are yours too, if you want them. But understand what you're taking on. Those photos will stay with you forever. Once you've seen your father's journey from vital man to skeleton, once you've witnessed love that persists beyond the point where persistence seems possible, you can't unsee it. You can't pretend that marriage is just about happiness and mutual support. I think I need to see it. I think I need to understand what you went through, what he went through. Then take them. But take them because you're ready to carry that knowledge, not because you feel obligated to. Madison's coming back, he said suddenly, his voice dropping to a whisper. She's been on the phone with her mother for the past hour. I could imagine that conversation. Madison's mother, probably shocked that her daughter's perfect honeymoon had been disrupted by something as pedestrian as family history. Madison seeking permission to flee from complications she'd never been taught to navigate, validation that her discomfort was reasonable rather than evidence of emotional immaturity. What did her mother say? That this is abusive. That you're trying to control me through emotional manipulation. That we should come home immediately and consider getting a restraining order. A restraining order against grief? I couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. Against family history? Against the evidence that your father loved you enough to write letters for milestones he'd never see. I tried to explain about the letters, about Dad writing to his future grandchildren. But she just kept saying it was sick, that dead people don't write letters. Dead people don't write letters, I agreed. But dying people write letters to the living people they'll miss. Dying people document their love because they know memory is fragile and time is finite. There's nothing sick about that unless you think love itself is sick. She wants us to leave tonight. To pack up and catch the red-eye back to San Francisco. And what do you want? The pause stretched between us, filled with the weight of a decision that would define not just his marriage, but his understanding of what family meant, what love cost, what commitment required when tested by uncomfortable realities. I want to read the letters, he said finally. All of them. I want to understand what I missed, what you protected me from. I want to know what Dad was thinking about when he knew he was dying. And Madison? Madison wants to pretend this never happened. She wants to go back to San Francisco and plan our future as if my past doesn't exist. Can you do that? Can you pretend you haven't seen what you've seen? No, he whispered. I can't. I can't pretend I don't know that Dad wrote me letters for my wedding day and my future children's birthdays. I can't pretend I don't know what you went through, taking care of him and protecting me at the same time. I can't pretend that marriage is just about being happy together. Then you have your answer. But what if she can't accept that? What if she can't live with the fact that I know these things now? Then you'll learn something important about the woman you married. You'll learn whether she loves you enough to accept your whole story or whether she only wants the edited version. That's a terrible thing to learn on your honeymoon. It's a necessary thing to learn before you build a life together. Better to know now than to discover it 10 years from now when you're dealing with your first real crisis together. The photos of Dad in the hospital, they're so different from how I remember him. They're how he was when you weren't there, when he thought no one was watching, when he didn't have to pretend to be brave for your sake. He looked so scared. He was scared, terrified, not of dying, necessarily, but of leaving us behind, of not being there to guide you through college and career choices and heartbreaks and all the other milestones parents think they'll have time to navigate with their children. I never knew. You weren't supposed to know. You were 16 and dealing with your own grief and fear. My job was to protect you from the parts of his dying that would have been too heavy for you to carry. But I'm not 16 anymore. No, I agreed. You're not. Which is why you get to see the whole truth now. Why you get to understand what love looks like when it's tested by impossible circumstances. Madison's back, he said, and I could hear her voice in the background, sharp with the kind of anger that comes from having your worldview challenged by inconvenient realities. What's she saying? That she can't stay here. That this house is full of ghosts and memories that don't belong to us. That we should be starting our own history instead of dwelling on yours and Dad's. She's not wrong about the ghosts, I admitted. The house is full of memories. But they're good memories, mostly. Memories of love that was strong enough to survive anything life threw at it. She doesn't see it that way. She sees it as competition, evidence that you had a life and family and love before you met her. Some people can accept that their partner comes with history, and some people need to be the only chapter in the book. Is that fair to her? It's fair to expect that someone who marries you accepts your whole self, including your past and your family and your complicated relationship with loss and love. It's fair to expect that someone who claims to love you can handle the parts of your story that aren't convenient or comfortable. But she never signed up for this. She didn't know about the photos or the letters or any of it. She signed up to marry you, I said firmly. That means she signed up for your history, your family, your grief, your joy, all of it. That's what marriage is, Ethan. It's not just agreeing to love someone's best qualities. It's agreeing to accept their worst moments, their most difficult truths, their most complicated relationships. I don't think she understood that. Then you have some serious conversations ahead of you about what you both thought marriage meant and what you're both willing to give and accept. She's crying now. Real crying, not just anger. What kind of crying? The kind that sounds like she's grieving something. I thought about Madison, probably sitting on the bed where David and I had made love and plans and promises we'd thought were permanent, surrounded by evidence of a marriage that had endured beyond what anyone should have to endure, confronted with expectations she'd never been prepared to meet. Maybe she's grieving the fantasy of marriage she had before tonight. The idea that love is just about happiness and compatibility and shared goals. Maybe she's realizing that real marriage involves carrying each other's worst moments as well as celebrating the best ones. Is that what you and Dad had? That's what we learned to have. We started out thinking love was about finding someone who made us happy. We learned that love was about becoming someone worthy of the trust another person placed in us. We learned that commitment meant staying not just through the good times, but through the times when staying felt impossible. The letter he wrote for when I become a father. What does it say? I closed my eyes, remembering David's face as he'd written that particular letter, how he'd stopped and started a dozen times, how he'd asked me to help him find the words to explain fatherhood to a son who didn't yet understand what it meant to be responsible for another human being's entire world. It says that becoming a father will split your heart in two, one half that belongs to your child forever and one half that belongs to the person who gave you that child. It says that you'll understand for the first time how much your own parents loved you and how many sacrifices they made that you never noticed. It says that having children doesn't complete you, it terrifies you, because suddenly you have something you couldn't bear to lose. I can't imagine being a father without him there to ask for advice. He knew you'd feel that way. That's why he wrote down everything he wanted to tell you about being a husband and a father and a man. Everything he wished his own father had told him. Madison and I have talked about having children. And now you'll understand what that means in a way you didn't before. You'll understand that having children means creating people you'll love more than your own life, people you'll worry about every day for the rest of your existence, people who will break your heart with their beauty and their vulnerability and their absolute dependence on your ability to guide them safely through a world that can be incredibly cruel. That's terrifying. It's supposed to be terrifying. If it weren't terrifying, everyone would be good at it. If it weren't terrifying, it wouldn't be the most important thing you'll ever do. Madison stopped crying. She's packing. The statement hung between us, heavy with implication. I could picture her folding the expensive honeymoon wardrobe with mechanical precision, each movement sharp with the kind of anger that comes from having your expectations shattered by inconvenient truths. Are you going to let her leave? I don't know how to stop her. I don't know what to say that would make this easier for her to accept. You can't make it easier, sweetheart. Some truths aren't meant to be easy. Some realities can't be softened or edited to make them more palatable. You can only decide whether you're going to be honest about who you are and what you need, or whether you're going to hide parts of yourself to make someone else more comfortable. She says she needs time to process this, that she can't think clearly while surrounded by all these memories that don't belong to her. The memories don't belong to her. I agreed. But you do. And those memories shaped you into the person she fell in love with. She can't have one without the other. Maybe if I talked to her parents, explained about Dad's letters.
Ήταν ίντερ.
You can't fix this by explaining better or trying harder. This isn't a misunderstanding that can be cleared up with more information. This is a fundamental difference in how you and Madison understand what family means, what love requires, what marriage actually entails. So, what do? You tell her the truth. You tell her that this is who you are, someone whose father loved him enough to write letters for milestones he'd never see, someone whose mother documented love's persistence through impossible circumstances, someone who comes from a family that doesn't edit out the parts that are uncomfortable or inconvenient. And then you let her decide whether that's someone she can love completely or whether she needs someone with less complicated history. And if she decides she can't handle it, then you'll know something important about the woman you married. And you'll have to decide whether you can build a life with someone who needs you to hide fundamental parts of yourself in order to feel comfortable. I love her, Mom. I know you do, sweetheart. But love isn't always enough. Sometimes you need compatibility too. Sometimes you need someone who can accept your whole story, not just the chapters that make them feel good about themselves. The house, should we leave? Should I respect her need to get away from all these memories? I considered the question, thinking about the sanctuary David and I had created, the place where we'd planned to grow old together, where I'd scattered his ashes because I couldn't bear to keep them in a house that felt empty without him. The house is yours for the week if you want to stay. But don't stay just to prove a point or because you think you owe it to me or your father's memory. Stay because you want to be there, because you want to understand what that place meant to us and what it could mean to you. I think I do want to stay. I think I need to read all the letters, to see all the photos, to understand everything I missed. And Madison? Madison needs what Madison needs. I can't make that decision for her. The wisdom in his voice surprised me, the first indication that the boy who had excluded me from his wedding was beginning to understand what it meant to be a man capable of difficult choices. I'm proud of you, I said, and meant it completely. For what? For being willing to see the truth even when it's uncomfortable. For choosing understanding over ignorance, even when ignorance would be easier. I don't feel proud. I feel like I've been living in a fantasy, like I've been a child pretending to be an adult. Growing up is realizing that the adults around you were making it up as they went along too. Growing up is understanding that love isn't about finding someone who makes you happy. It's about becoming someone worthy of another person's trust and commitment. Madison's coming back to the room. I think she wants to talk. Then talk. Be honest about what you've learned and what you need. Be honest about what kind of marriage you want and what you're willing to sacrifice for it. Will you stay on the phone? In case I need to call you back. I'll be here all night if you need me. That's what mothers do, sweetheart. We stay available for the conversations that matter. I love you, Mom. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what that means. Love you too, Ethan. More than you'll understand until you have children of your own. I hung up and sat in the darkness of my bedroom, surrounded by the familiar shapes of furniture David and I had chosen together, listening to the house settle around me with the weight of memories and time. Outside my window, the same stars that were shining over Maui painted patterns across the sky, connecting me to my son across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. My phone remained silent for the next 3 hours. I dozed fitfully in my reading chair, waking at every small sound, alert for the call that would tell me how the most important conversation of my son's marriage had ended. At 2:47 a.m., my phone finally rang. Mom, Ethan's voice was different, calmer, sadder, but somehow more substantial than it had been earlier. The voice of someone who had been forced to reckon with realities he'd been avoiding. How did it go? She's leaving in the morning, catching the earliest flight back to San Francisco. The statement carried the weight of finality, the end of more than just a honeymoon. And you?
I'm staying.
I'm going to read every letter Dad wrote. I'm going to look at every photo you took. I'm going to try to understand what you both went through and what it means to love someone enough to document their worst moments.
I'm sorry, sweetheart.
Don't be sorry.
Be proud.
I finally grew up enough to handle the truth about my own family. What did Madison say? That she can't be married to someone whose family keeps secrets like this. That she needs someone whose past doesn't intrude on their future. That she can't build a life with someone who comes with this much complicated history. And what did you say? I said I understood. I said I was sorry she felt that way, but that I couldn't pretend this part of my life doesn't exist. I couldn't promise to hide my father's letters, or forget what my mother went through, or pretend that marriage is just about being happy together. That was very brave. It was very necessary. I realized tonight that I don't want a marriage built on hiding parts of myself. I don't want to love someone who can only accept the edited version of my life. It's going to hurt for a while. I know. But it's better to hurt now than to spend years pretending to be someone I'm not. Your father would be proud of you. I hope so. I'm going to read his letter for my wedding day tomorrow. I want to understand what he thought marriage should be. He thought marriage should be about truth-telling and burden-sharing and staying present for each other's worst moments as well as the best ones. That's what you had together? That's what we learned to have together. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always beautiful, but it was real. It was honest. It was love that didn't depend on convenience or comfort. I want that someday. When I'm ready for it. You'll know when you meet someone who can handle your whole story. Someone who sees your complicated history as evidence of your capacity for love rather than as competition for your attention. Will you come to Maui? While I'm here? The invitation surprised me, offered with the hesitant hope of someone trying to rebuild a relationship they'd nearly destroyed through carelessness and neglect. Do you want me to come? I want to understand what this place meant to you and Dad. I want to see it through your eyes instead of just using it as a convenient vacation rental. Then I'll come. I'll book a flight for tomorrow evening. Thank you, Mom.
For everything.
For the trunk, for the letters, for loving me enough to tell me the truth even when it hurt. That's what love is, sweetheart. It's telling the truth even when the truth is inconvenient. It's staying present even when presence is painful. It's documenting the hard parts as well as the easy ones because memory is fragile and love is worth preserving. I understand that now. I know you do. And that understanding will serve you well, whether you're single or married or somewhere in between. Understanding what love actually costs makes you capable of paying that price when it matters. I'll see you tomorrow? You'll see me tomorrow. And we'll read your father's letters together, and I'll tell you stories about the man who loved you enough to write to grandchildren he'd never meet. I'd like that. So would he. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness for a long time, thinking about the cost of love and the price of truth-telling and the strange alchemy that transforms loss into wisdom. Tomorrow I would return to the place where David and I had been happiest, would share our sanctuary with a son who had finally grown brave enough to inherit it properly. Some gifts can only be received when we're ready to bear their weight. Some truths can only be told when we're strong enough to carry their implications. Some love can only be understood when we're mature enough to accept its demands. Tonight, my son had finally grown into someone worthy of his father's letters and his mother's difficult honesty. Tonight, he had chosen truth over comfort, understanding over ignorance, real love over convenient illusion. It wasn't the wedding gift I'd planned to give him, but it was the one he'd needed most. The gift of seeing his family clearly, completely, without editing or sanitization. The gift of understanding what love looked like when tested by impossible circumstances. The gift of being ready, finally, to inherit the legacy of people who had loved each other enough to document their worst moments as well as their best ones. Outside my window, dawn was beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Another day without David, but somehow, for the first time in 5 years, a day filled with purpose and hope and the possibility of healing. I had work to do. A flight to book, a reunion to prepare for, a sanctuary to share with someone who was finally ready to understand its meaning. Some doors, once opened, lead to rooms we didn't know we needed to enter. Some gifts, once unwrapped, reveal truths we weren't prepared to receive. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, the people we love grow brave enough to handle the whole truth about what love actually requires.